It's funny, by the 70s, so in the 60s, a series of tests are started to see if you restrict saturated fat, replace it with monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fats, whether you'll save lives. And the answer is they have no idea. You know, some studies maybe, other studies maybe not. It's certainly not a quick fix, and there's at least one huge study that shows that you get more deaths if you boost the lower saturated fat. So they launched two huge studies that are going to address parts of this hypothesis. Again, not realizing really that it's not enough to just address parts of a hypothesis. You got to get the whole thing. And now the NIH spending $250 million to test the hypothesis. And Congress has given them the go-ahead to spend that money. But to the layperson, if you refute a hypothesis, you've wasted money. Okay, so once you decide to spend hundreds of millions, and this is still true today. I mean, it's you just can't accept that you spend money to prove that you were wrong, even though all of science is about trying to prove that you're wrong.
Yeah, it's funny. Everyone expects, hey, $100 million in, I want a freaking shiny widget, right?
Yeah,
but science is not about, it's like proving the opposite.
I want to know I was right all along, right? And my congressman wanted, so as soon as you do the studies, there's this incredible motivation to spin the results to make it clear that that money was well spent. Also because you want people to give you more money. And we've got this public health catastrophe. People are dying out there, so we've got to give them advice. And even if we can't prove that we're right, if we think we're right, that's what we should tell people. I mean, I do that in the sugar book. I say, I don't know if I'm right. I think this is right. Here's the argument. Here's the evidence. Here's the problems with the evidence. Decide for yourself, man. Yeah. But public health people can't do that.
They need to give guidance.
They got to give,
that's their job.
And they got to make that, in order to get us to follow it.
Yeah.
They got to make the guidance look like it's just chiseled in stone, and then they forget that it's not.
Science is not.
That science is not, yeah.
I'd love to hear that case. Like, I think that's like a great sort of way to frame it. Like, you almost litigate like on a criminal justice system. Like, here are the facts, and let's litigate it from. I think that's more understandable for lay people, right? Like, let's litigate also, this.
You know, if I could solve one of the things in an ideal world, like if you have any wealthy people who listen to this, what would I do to solve this? One of the things I would do. Because, again, one of the problems here is you got a journalist saying, you know, the fundamental bedrock dogma, not just of obesity research, but a lot of nutrition is this calorie thing. And it's not even, you know, Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, but it's not even wrong. It's so meaningless. Okay? It's the wrong paradigm. You can't make any progress. So who's going to believe? I mean, really, what are the chances that I'm right? No matter how many people I say have also said this, what are the chances that the journalist is right? So what I'm always hoping is if I'm right, there are still some very good scientists in the world. You can get them, they would see it the way I would see it.
Yeah.
So I want a jury trial of let's say they're not even my peers. They're far better than my peers. I want a jury trial where the jury is 12 exceedingly smart scientists without bias. Okay, just like you want your jury to be unbiased, and then you have a defense team and a prosecuting team, and those teams present evidence. Here's the evidence we've got, and the only difference is in this case that the jury is allowed to question the nature of the evidence, and the jury is allowed to say what other evidence they need in order to, you know, for them to make their judgment which of these arguments are correct. And I think if you had that kind of institution, so what we have today is consensuses formed based on the thinking of the leading people in the field, but the leading people in the field invariably have a kind of groupthink, whatever the science is. It could be anything from cosmology to the kind of nutrition stuff we're talking about. The way you become influential is and move up in your field is to think like your colleagues. We all have this problem that we think people are smart who agree with us. Right?
It's sort of ego. I mean, that's just life, right? You have to, people reward, well, it also benefits yourself, right? Like, if other smart people think the same way I do, clearly I'm smart too.
Well, that's true. But also, if they think the same way I do, then clearly I think they're smart. Yeah. So, and they're the ones I promote, and they're the ones I respect. And so it's very easy to form a consensus around
And I think that oftentimes we're all living in our little bubbles. Yeah. Like, just with what happened with the recent election, I think there's factions of the United States who are surprised by the results because we're all sort of getting information from so many sources, so
Right.
we're kind of in a bubble. And I think that just with medicine, I feel like there is certain bubbles, like institutional bubbles and research bubbles.
Well, it's funny when you do as a reporter, when you address these. So there's some fascinating concepts I came upon. I kind of do this sort of blanket reporting where I just talk to people, hundreds of people, until finally nobody can recommend anyone else I should talk to I haven't spoken to, or nobody has said anything new to me that I haven't heard for like 20 interviews. But you never know if you're trapped in a bubble.
Until you actually go out and talk to everybody.
Well, but even then, there are there are concepts. Like in nutrition, one of the interesting concepts was that the liver is the sense organ that basically is detecting whether or not we have enough energy available in our body, and then signaling to our brain through a variety of mechanisms whether or not we should pursue food-seeking behavior, feel hungry, or inhibit food-seeking behavior. And it's a fascinating theory, and it makes a lot of sense. And there are about, 4 labs that were looking into this back in the 80s, and then it kind of vanishes. Did it vanish because it was refuted, or did it vanish because these 4 labs could never get enough other people who are, far more centrally focused to pay attention? And so you're constantly finding these concepts that live in these little bubbles inside these bigger communities. When I first discovered, if we talked about cancer, the link between insulin and IGF and cancer, and so this had come out of diabetes research, because the diabetes people who studied insulin and insulin-like growth factor. And when I first started looking into that in the early 2000s, again, it was fascinating, and some diabetes researchers believed it, and they told this interesting story, and some of the work was done by a guy who won a Nobel Prize for other work, so that was a good, sign that it wasn't crazy. But now I had to find people in the cancer research community who knew enough about it to comment on whether it had any problem, because it existed in a bubble.
Right.
And I went around and around, and finally I found one guy at MIT who's Robert Weinberg, who's writing a book. He was writing his first textbook at the time, and he had to learn about it in order to write the textbook, even though it didn't end up in the textbook. And when I first spoke to him, he only knew half of the story. I had to tell him the other half of it because he hadn't gotten into that bubble with his research. Right. I talked to a few Nobel laureates. They just didn't know about it. Now they do. Now it's spread to the point that you can get informed opinions from outside the people who do it. But I
think the internet has really enabled and accelerated that, right? I think that's like one of the interesting points today, where like smart people that don't necessarily have all the Ivy League degrees can actually look at the first the actual literature. Well, and start engaging with other smart people and find the truth, right? Beyond these gatekeepers of knowledge.
Well, that's the thing, and the gatekeepers used to be, they're consciously or unconsciously, they determine what we knew. So when the medical community, for instance, decided that Atkins was pushing quackery, it existed only in the land of quackery for 20, 30 years. Journalists weren't going to write it up as something other than that because they weren't going to take the chance of looking like. So the internet begins to spread this information around beyond the gatekeepers. It's both good and bad, because we saw what happened in the recent election, where you get, you choose what source of information you want, so it can spread quackery or alternative facts as easily as it could spread real
it's basically rocket fuel on interesting sparks. And it could be used for good or truth, or it can be used for some quackery so it can spread really
But
quickly.
it democratized the spread of information. It took, so you could learn about these diets. If you think about how ketogenic diets first started getting studied, so there's some studies, in the 70s.
Epileptic children.
No, well, not just taking it. It's studied as a diet, weight loss or performance diet.
Finney and Volek, or talking about Finney and Volek, or
Finney and Volek's work. Finney's work back then. Volek came later. So then in the late 90s, after it was clear there was an obesity epidemic on their hand, doctors, physicians would have patients go on these diets, and the patients and they go on these diets against their will. You know, the
Right.
doctor would say, you can't go on Atkins. It's going to clog your arteries and kill you and make you fatter. And they'd do it anyway. And they'd come back like 6 months later having lost 30 pounds. And they'd do a cholesterol profile. And lo and behold, their lipids had improved.
Right.
And some of the doctors just said, well, you're still killing yourself. But a few of them said, Jesus,
Hey,
this is
interesting.
fascinating.
Right.
And decided they would study it. So just this was kind of pre-internet, but just because of the popularity of Atkins, you had it start to spread around the gatekeepers. And then once the internet comes crashing in, it's like now anyone can learn, regardless of what their doctor says. Right. You can learn about it. You can see the experience of others. You could find out what happens. You could try it yourself. You could talk about, you could find the chat groups online where you can discuss how to do it and what to do. So it does definitely, I think one of the reasons why it's, when I get discouraged by the responses from the establishment and their just, fierce belief that obesity is an energy balance disorder, you just see that this intervention just keeps growing and growing,
it's actually
because
helping people too.
It's so effective. It's so remarkably effective, not for everyone.
Right.
But compared to drugs, man, it's like a miracle
absolutely.
cure.
I mean, I think just like from our community, at the We fasting community, I know personally, like, Dr. Lamb, stuck, to the dogma of like, okay, diabetic type 2's insulin.
Right.
And I think when we were talking about this before, like people just got fatter and worse, right? Because insulin is a fat storage hormone. Right. And you're basically like giving an alcoholic more and more alcohol to treat their alcoholism.
Yeah, but this is...
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is like one of my mentors would say, don't treat the number, treat the patient.
Right.
And I think that in diabetes, I think it was one of those, come to Jesus moments where, we've been, when we check someone's hemoglobin A1C, we're really checking for the point in which doctors are going to start treatment, right? Because insulin resistance is a spectrum. You don't just have pre-diabetes and all of a sudden you have diabetes. It's a spectrum, and the cutoffs are really for, to tell doctors when to start something. And then there's actually a push to start people on insulin earlier and earlier and earlier, and that's something that I thought was correct.
Where was your mentor, by the way? I'm just curious.
My mentor, I mean, he's currently, he was at Stanford and now.
Okay, because it's just, there's so much of medicine has become about treating the number.
Right.
That I hear somebody say something like that.
Exactly.
I want to give them a psychic hug.
I think I think one of the interesting things about diabetes is that since we don't on a regular basis check insulin, we're just checking blood sugars, which is really just the number, but we're not really treating the patient, which is the insulin resistance.
Point in time.
Right. It's a point in time. So for the longest time, I agreed with what everybody was saying when it comes to insulin. But if you look at the pathophysiology, biochemistry of diabetes, if diabetes is a hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance problem, why are we giving more insulin?
Well, this is what, again, going back into history, and remind me if I forget to get to Kahneman on this and thinking fast and slow. Okay. But historically, before insulin was discovered, diabetes was kind of perceived as a carbohydrate intolerance disease, right? Because you couldn't metabolize the carbs. So it was treated either by, type 1 was treated by the kind of starvation diet, and type 2 by a carbohydrate restricted diet. In effect, meat and green vegetables was all they ate. As soon as you discover insulin, as soon as Banting and Best discover insulin, diabetes becomes an insulin deficiency problem. And of course, they didn't know the difference. They didn't know back then that type 2 was insulin resistance.
Right.
So now you've got the absence of a drug is the problem, and it's now cured by the drug. And you start jacking up the carb content of the diet, because if you give too much insulin or poorly dose the insulin, you can deal with hypoglycemia. Right. So the way you deal with that is by giving carbs. So all the thinking about preventing and about treating by diet vanishes or changes dramatically as soon as insulin's discovered, because now you've changed where the spotlight is.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things I read in your book was that I think there was this physician named Allen or something that actually admitted patients. Like, it was in the 1910s, right before insulin was discovered in 1921, and his treatment for type 2 diabetics, or actually just diabetics in general, because they couldn't differentiate between type 1s or type 2s back then, was that they would admit these patients into the hospital and then fast them, or just starve them, quote unquote, fast them. And then the type 2 diabetics would actually get better, and the type 1s got worse. And I think there was this kind of, what's going on there. And then in 1921, when insulin was discovered, all of a sudden these type 1s were doing better. And then type 2s were also doing better, but that was just treating the number.
Right.
Their blood sugars were more controlled.
Well,
but then there's this kind of this, they're gaining more weight because insulin being a storage hormone, like Jeff was saying.
I mean, there's another aspect to this which isn't in the book. The University of Michigan physician researcher I mentioned, who was so convinced that obesity is a gluttony and sloth disorder, and his theory sort of carried the day post World War II because he was an American. He 1920, 21, 22 published 2 articles in JAMA using low-carb, high-fat diets to treat diabetics, both type 1 and type 2, because they weren't differentiating. And he reported remarkable results. He said you could feed them higher calories than you would with the starvation diet. You can jack up the calories. You can keep their weight on them. You can make them healthier. And Elliot Jocelyn, the leading diabetes researcher of the day, bought into this and started using it in his clinic. And as soon as insulin is discovered, it vanishes. Because you can't give insulin in these diets because then you get hypoglycemia.
Right.
It's fascinating how, by studying the history, you could understand how, I mean, it's, again, if somebody takes the wrong road, scientifically, philosophically, intellectually, you got to go back to where the roads fork to find out what happened, right?
I want to, obviously, I think we talked sort of ancillary around all the different, I guess the context around where science and public policy went bad. Help us summarize here, like the 3 most compelling, factoids, if you will, that our listeners can take away around the case against sugar. Like what are the 3 biggest, things that
okay, so
here? Yeah.
If we're litigating the case against sugar, right, we have to understand what crime are we accusing it of having committed.
Sure.
And so that's we have epidemics of obesity and diabetes worldwide. That's what I am trying to sort of focus in on these books, because they often get forgotten. And what's, like people didn't, I was talking to a woman in the UK today about a diet doctor over there who thinks everyone should eat kimchi and, artichokes for their gut biome. And I said, well, clearly, the people, we don't have diabetes epidemics among the Inuit and the First Nations people because they weren't eating artichokes and kimchi. So it's quite likely that that's not the reason why there's a diabetes epidemic. But what we want to explain is that obesity and diabetes epidemics worldwide, whenever populations become westernized or urbanized, it doesn't matter what their traditional diets were. It could be anything from Southeast Asian diets with a lot of rice to Inuit diet with a lot of caribou and whale meat to Maasai diets to pick a diet. When they become westernized and urbanized. So if it was chronic diseases we were talking about, the vector of the chronic disease, of infectious diseases, the vector would be the Western diet, right? So,
or is it Western lifestyle, being devil's advocate? So something with Western.
Something, diet or lifestyle.
Sure,
There's something about it that's causing these diseases, just like, we could say when you get a cholera epidemic, the plague, and it's particularly bad in tenements, that it's the rats or the cockroaches, one of those is a vector. But now we have to identify the agent. What is it that the vector is, what is it in the vector that's giving us the disease? And so what I'm arguing is sugar is the agent. So first of all, it's always at the scene of the crime, going back now to a criminal justice metaphor. And whenever, sugar is an absolutely vital part of any nutrition transition. And you can increase in sugar consumption. And it doesn't matter whether, again, we're talking Southeast Asians or Inuits or Maasai or Hunza in the Himalayas. They become urbanized, westernized, they eat more sugar. Sometimes you can find populations that don't eat, have manifest obesity and diabetes epidemics without eating vegetable oils or ultra-processed foods or, are extremely physically active. So we don't have to blame. We can rule out sedentary behavior if you're a believer in that, whatever causes these epidemics in one population causes it in all of them. So that's how... So sugar is always at the scene of the crime. And then talking type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, we're talking, the insulin resistance, and some very good research suggests that insulin resistance starts with hepatic insulin resistance in the liver, and that starts, or at least associates with the accumulation of fat in liver cells, and particularly a type of fat called diacylglycerol, which is 2 fatty acids in a glycerol molecule instead of 3 as in triglycerides. So, and then the fructose component of sugar and beet and cane sugar and high fructose corn syrup are, a glucose and fructose in roughly 50-50 mixtures, and that fructose is metabolized in the liver. So it's at the scene of the crime in the body, and it's also metabolized because of the glucose in a high insulin environment and a high blood sugar environment. And when you do that, and you do it in high doses, as we do in Western diets and lifestyles, you end up with converting the fructose to fat. So, again, my very simplistic journalistic first principles understanding, it's always there. And historically, when people noticed diabetes epidemics beginning to emerge, they invariably said, hey, man, the sugar consumption's skyrocketing.
Yep.
Maybe it's the sugar. And now you have it in the right organ. You have it with the right weapon. We don't have a smoking gun because those studies are really hard to do. So I think I could get an indictment. I'm sure I can get an indictment.
Yeah.
My book is an indictment. Could I get a conviction? It depends on how much I could sway the jury with circumstantial evidence and ambiguous data.
Right.
So, so that's the message. And then the message is if sugar causes diabetes, and it's a causality very much like when we say cigarettes cause lung cancer, and we don't tell people to smoke in moderation. We don't say smoking too much causes lung cancer.
Right. Having a label like this causes cancer.
May
cause death.
Yeah. So if sugar causes diabetes, and if you could establish that to the level that we need, it changes the conversation. Right. And changes. I'm a parent, so it changes the way I think about feeding my kids. If am I going to? How much do you let them have when it, if they get this disease
how does it
later?
practically? I'm curious. Practically, then, like obviously you're coming in from a historical perspective. Yeah. How, do you eat no sugar now? Do you have no carbs? Like what is the day-to-day life in Gary's household in terms of food? I really haven't been eating sugar or much carbs for about 15 years. So I was doing the research for good calories, bad calories. I had tried Atkins diet as an experiment, and at least for me, it was very effective. Right. It's like you flick a switch and you start losing weight that you've never been able to lose. It's bizarre, and it's, I think it's an absolutely necessary phenomenon to really understand what happens on these diets. But anyway, then I fell off. Then I started doing the research for good calories, bad calories, and it was clear that, to me, that this was a healthy way to eat and that I would benefit from doing it. And as I understood the science underneath it, which not even Atkins, a lot of these people, for a variety of reasons, never really nailed what I think was the critical part of the science, which is the insulin axis. I stayed on it. So I haven't eaten, I don't eat starches or grains for the most part. And whenever I get suckered into the paleo story and try to have a little bit of a sweet potato for dinner, I end up going into a food coma like 30 minutes later, and I'm sound asleep. And it's the same phenomenon that used to happen when I was a kid. Are you trying to load up on fat, like additional fat?
I've lately gotten addicted to bulletproof coffee, and I'm a little bit worried about it.
Butter.
Just because I'm not sure we evolved to drink hot coffee and MCT oil, no matter how much it might. And it's interesting because I do, I wake up craving it. It's like a regular cup of coffee is. I travel with, travel packs of coconut butter from Trader Joe's, coconut oil.
Actually, one of the things I wanted to talk about was, I think in our group, one of the things that we do as a group is that we do intermittent fasting. Right. And so once a week at, our We Fast community does like a 36-hour fast, and we've hosted, 7-day fasts on a regular basis.
Yeah, I'm curious about your thinking
as
around
a skeptic. I've heard in other podcasts, you're like a healthy skeptic regarding fasting. So just wanted to hear what you thought about it, because from my experience, I actually came to your work, low carb, high fat, ketosis, ketogenic diets, after actually reading about fasting. Because when I looked into fasting, I looked into the biochemistry, and ketosis seems to be this thing that you want.
I think it's interesting because, if you think that sugar is affected by hormones, or is a hormone, or obesity is a hormone related thing, clearly intermittent fasting affects a lot of hormonal responses as well.
That's the thing. So I don't think
it's a very similar mechanism. But I'm curious, like,
well,
how
that's
you
the thing.
differentiate
So
and distinguish.
it's a way to, I don't see it as a way to eat less calories, calorie reduction. I see it, if it works, it's going to work through probably the insulin IGF axis, among keeping it lower longer and allowing all these processes to occur that are inhibited when insulin and IGF are elevated. My skepticism is, well, first of all, you just never know, I mean,
but like the argument of going back to history, right?
It's
our ancestors have gone through feast and famine situations,
they did,
but now we're constantly eating.
But they went through feast and famine far more after agriculture was discovered than before. So, hunter-gatherers, I have a very resilient, because they hunt and gather so many different foods, that their food supply is thought to be far more resilient than agriculturalists. And monocultures, where your entire crop can be wiped out by a famine. So I'm not quite so convinced that it was a required part, but I do think that people, when they're not eating carbs, it's certainly a lot easier to skip meals, right? Because your insulin's low anyway, and you're burning your own fat. You have much more fuel available to burn, so you can go longer periods. So I can't imagine it having the negative side effects in that sense. The way, if you were saying take this, great new chemical.
It's another one of these things where you stop doing something, right? Like stop eating carbs is like stop eating, period. I mean, different degrees of stop doing something.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So in that sense, my skepticism comes in terms of, are there real benefits that are long lasting if you continue to do it, and do the people who swear by it today, are they going to be? So I know from personal experience, and again, this is what I see, that it's very easy to maintain a low-carb lifestyle if you happen to like things like, animal products and bacon and butter. Doesn't mean it's not going to kill me, though, but it's easy for me to maintain. I worry that, 5 years from now, intermittent fasting will have been what you did in 2017, because it's just easier. It's, for whatever reason, it doesn't, it requires more of a sacrifice, and the benefits may not be
funny,
as clear.
I would say it's the opposite. I think it's being disciplined for short bursts is easier than never have a beer or a pizza.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things.
It's funny. It's like basically, I think like the very similar mechanism how these both affect. Right, I agree. I think it basically both on underlying mechanisms like reducing insulin, increasing the sensitivity towards insulin, and reducing IGF-1. I think that's why as biohackers, we're continuous glucose monitors, right? Yeah. So we do tell that like before fasting and after fasting, our baseline blood glucose resting is lower at post fast, right? So
CGMs are going to change the world, I think.
I mean,
they really, and these are you pointed to your arm, so the circular, the European.
We get them on gray market through eBay, but although Dr. Lamb is a doctor, so he's been able to essentially.
Well, feel free to connect me afterwards. I'd love to try it. I do think, and you can see CGMs changing the world already. Absolutely. In the type 1 diabetics who are, now there's a whole.
I want to, absolutely. I mean, I think we have, took a lot of your time. I want to give you the last word for our listeners out there. I mean, it sounds like very clearly, hey, we should at least at minimum be thoughtful that, hey, let's look at our sugar intake and probably start minimizing that to the extent that we can. I think as a baseline. Any other sort of, I'm curious, any other last remaining points to help push in the awareness of this broad, I think, pattern that we think will be. I mean, I think we all agree in this room that big sugar will look like big tobacco in 10, 20 years. I think that's kind of will be a part of our mission here to help sort of expedite that message. What's next on your radar? If there's something that's interesting else on that radar that you're looking at, or if there's, we should focus on the sugar epidemic.
Well, again,
I want to give you the last word
to me, it's the sugar and the white flour basically are sugar first and then the refined grains second are the problems with modern diets. And, again, I have people who are sort of constantly a little upset with me that I don't buy into the vegetable oil story the way they do. And I find the evidence less compelling, but I don't know, maybe vegetable oils are just as bad, or they cause it, maybe, they cause a different issue or a different part of this issue. I think everyone can be healthy. One of the interesting things you point out is, and I'm thinking back to when I was younger, and so much of my work was fueled by sugar rushes. So sugar and caffeine's an incredibly powerful, drug, whether it's in the form of a Coke or a Dr. Pepper or an energy drink. And it's sort of back in the days when like this is all you do, it's you don't really care. Part of being young is like I don't care. I drove motorcycles, I took drugs, I boxed, I did a lot of things that were stupid in retrospect and that I'm probably paying for still today. But the question is so if you want the cognitive potency that you get from the sugar rush without the sugar, and this is where things like bulletproof coffee or maybe intermittent fasting or certain ketosis is if you find that you're working at a high cognitive level without having to. I remember writing a screenplay once when I lived in LA with a friend. We used to get together to collaborate. We'd get together to meet at, Annie's Pretzels. And you'd get one of those like sugary pretzels, and they were delicious. And my IQ went up 30 points for like the next hour and a half, and then I would crash. I would literally go, "Okay, I'm done." That's all you get, Right. And this is what we do when we're young.
Right.
I wasn't even that young then. I was probably late 30s. But anyway, it's an effective way to push. It's a performance enhancing drug.
I think it's a nice way to sort of wrap up here, right? Like there's multiple levers that operate our human system.
Right.
And I think at minimum, right, we should be aware of exactly how all these affect us short term and long term.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Gary. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Cool. That was a really fun conversation with Gary.
I had a really good time.
I know he was sort of a personal hero of yours after you have his books, and we got him to sign the books just before he was able to head out. Your quick thoughts on what you thought was most interesting, immediate feedback here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was nice to just hear about his personal journey through the last, he of all people was able to kind of really dig into the nutritional science, and I think that very few people actually have the opportunity to be able to dig, and I think that he provided an interesting alternative perspective or hypothesis to what is essentially mainstream. So I think that his ability to be able to think about stuff critically and be pessimistic about things, but then reevaluate, I thought was kind of an interesting.
Yeah, to me, I thought he did. I think he articulated a very good historical perspective on the history of nutrition. I think a lot of the science is very compelling and emerging and growing really quickly, right? If you look at the Google Trends around keto versus low fat, that's a very big trend. We see that with our community, with our research, with our science team. Clearly a lot of benefits around fasting, low carb, high fat, all these sort of interventions. So I don't even think it's alternative as much as this is the truth, and I think he's a very good voice in helping paint a historical context around it. And I see that we're a big community and a big voice in spreading this knowledge, along with great writers like Gary Taubes. I know the work that you've been doing with diabetics one-on-one, right? Literally taking them off insulin with a combination of fasting and low carb diets works, right? And I think it's we need voices like Gary to litigate in books. You need communities like We Fast and Nootrobox pushing biohacking, pushing taking control of our own health inputs as a part of that solution. And I think we also need doctors like yourself who are hey, some of the recommendations from American Diabetics Association, etc., are wrong. Mm-hmm. I think it's just we should not be afraid to look at the science, look at the results that we're seeing in vivo, and be hey, there's some disconnect here. We should be strong on pushing this forward. The areas that I wish we had a little bit more time to dive into were some of the performance benefits of sugar. I think that was an interesting thing that I don't think I've seen a lot of discussion around, right? On one hand, clearly probably too much hidden sugar in our diet. one interesting statistic that I've seen recently was that it's not even from like candies or anything. It's like literally embedded into the sauce, the pasta, the noodles.
Right. All these added sugars that you don't even keep account of.
Right, like 2% of sugar intake is from confections. So it's not literally not a candy's fault. It's like what's baked into our food supply. But I think the interesting part around it was that, hey, like there are performance benefits potentially around sugar, around different things, right? Like sugar, glucose is, we need glucose for anaerobic power move, like power exertion, right? Like you need that. So I think it's like, I think the whole thing that Nootrobox and what we should be a very clear voice in is that there's dogma on both sides, right? Like obviously the dogma is very heavily tilted towards standard Western diet with a lot of carbs. Does that mean like, hey, we go completely eating sticks of butter and drinking oil?
Right. Are there actual applications for sugar?
Are there applications for sugar? One and two. Like let's not be a complete bandwagon jumpers and just do a hard, 180, go the completely opposite direction, just like barrel down there without thinking either. So I think my goal here is that hopefully everyone, at least if not spark some interest, starts looking at all the different inputs in their body and seeing how and what levers they can play, right? I think that's how we started with Nootrobox. That's how we started with nootropics. That's how we started with fasting. That's how we're just getting started with ketones.
I think one of the interesting things you brought up about is like the application of certain compounds and at what, using pulling the levers at what point in time.
Yeah.
If your goals are weight loss or decreased body fat composition, maybe lower carb, high fat is great. But maybe if you're in like performance enhancement, or maybe there's that, last night of studying, is there actually a place potentially for sugar, or in the diet, or actually in the meal right before you perform certain like feats of like strength that potentially that uses anaerobic metabolism? Is there a way that potentially could actually be optimizing your state so that you can actually be faster, more powerful? And I think that I think there's, like you said, there are different sides of the coin, but I think it's a very interesting thing to kind of think about.
Yeah, I think that's like, as biohackers, that's what we're all about, right? Let's use the right compounds, the right protocols for the right use cases. So we'll leave it there. So Gary is just across the bay from us. We're in San Francisco. He's actually based in Oakland. So he'll be back on, and continue the conversation. So if you have questions that you'd like answered, or areas that you'd like to have us dive deeper into with Gary next time, please send it out. We're on, as always, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. Until next time, Jeff and Dr. Lamb out. That was fun. Peace.